Hi, welcome everybody, and welcome to this video for the Microsoft 365 Developer Day on Dual Screen Experiences. My name is Peter Torr, and I'm here to talk to you today about how Windows 10X runs UWP and Win32 apps. Now, you've heard a lot about Windows 10X and how it's a reimagining of Windows. It's running on a new class of devices with a new shell experience, and so you might be wondering how Windows 10X runs all these existing applications. Well, if we look at the history of Microsoft's platforms, from DOS through Windows, through Win64, through ARM, and so on, Microsoft has a long history of investing in application compatibility so that the investments that our customers and partners have made in their applications accrues to the new versions of Windows. So as the transition from DOS to Windows, or 32-bit Windows to 64-bit Windows, just as in those cases where the new versions of Windows run old Windows applications, we'll find that most existing UWP and Win32 apps will run on Windows 10X. And the purpose of this video is to have a high-level overview of how that happens. And the simple answer to how Windows 10X runs these applications is that Windows 10X runs all applications inside containers. Now, if you're a developer, you might be thinking of something like Docker, where it's a container configured by a developer or an IT administrator, and it's put across servers, etc. But these are different kind of containers. They're optimized for running Windows applications on Windows 10X, and there's no configuration that the developer or the user has to think about. These are all designed to just make the apps run. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail. There are three types of containers in Windows 10X. There's the Win32 container, there are MSIX containers, and there are native containers. And let's look at each one of those in turn. So the Win32 container is new for Windows 10X, and this is where all Win32 apps run on Windows 10X. Now, this container has the highest compatibility for existing apps, and it runs everything from Win32 apps to WinForms, Adobe PF apps, Electron apps, etc. The Win32 container has a similar environment to a desktop Windows OS, and there's a single Win32 container that runs all applications on Windows 10X. We'll dig into that a little bit in a minute. The second kind of container is not new. This exists already on Windows Desktop, and it's called the MSIX container. Now, this is where full trust MSIX applications run, and MSIX containers provide a degree of isolation from the operating system and from other applications. MSIX containers also give you a robust install, uninstall, and update experience without having to write a custom installer, and it has high compatibility with Windows 32 applications. Now, in Windows 10X, all MSIX containers also run inside the Win32 container, and we'll see that in a minute as well. And there are more videos available about MSIX if you need to learn more. And then finally, we have a native container, which is also an existing concept on Windows 10 Desktop or other Windows devices like Xbox, HoloLens, etc., also known as an app container. And this is where all UWP applications run, and this has the lowest system overhead, which means we provide the best application performance and battery life running in a native container, and also it has the best privacy and security controls so that customers are in control of where their data goes. So they're the three types of containers we have in Windows 10X. Let's have a look at a super high-level container architecture to kind of put these pieces together. So in this diagram here, we start off with a big blue box, and this represents the entire Windows 10 operating system, and we call this the host operating system. As you would expect from a normal operating system, this has a kernel and a set of drivers that run inside the host operating system. It also has a bunch of resources. So, for example, it has a network connection, it has access to devices like camera, location, microphone, and it contains the user's content, their photos, their music, their documents, etc. Now, in addition to the Windows 10X host operating system, we also have the Win32 container, which we call a guest operating system. And this has its own kernel and drivers as well. It's a separate kernel from the host. And it has its own resources to look like a Windows PC. So it has a Win32 file system, and it has a registry. Now, you might want to think of this somewhat like a virtual machine, but the Win32 container has better integration with the host and higher performance than a regular virtual machine. So conceptually it's similar, but there are some differences that improve the user experience, performance, etc. And so this is how the basic system is laid out. Now let's see how applications run in this environment. So on the left here, inside the Windows 10 host operating system, we have 3 UWP applications all running in their own native containers. And you can see the little lock icons there representing that these are secure app containers, and the applications have access to no resources that have not been authorized by the user. Over in the guest operating system, the Win32 container, we also have 3 applications running. 2 unpackaged Win32 apps, and then a MSIX packaged app, which is running inside its MSIX container inside the Win32 container. Now, the applications running inside the guest need a way to get input and output to the user through the mouse, keyboard, screen, etc. And the way that we do that is that on the host operating system, we run essentially an high-performance RDP client for each application running inside the guest. And so Windows App 1 has an RDP client, Windows App 2 has an RDP client, and Windows App 3 has an RDP client. And these are also known as proxy apps. You might see them when you're using the device and the emulator, and we'll see that in a little bit in a demo. But these are highly performant, highly optimized RDP clients that give very low latency input, output, etc. So it's similar to using a remote desktop, but it is a better user experience. So then how do these different applications access resources on the host and in the container? Well, on the Windows 10X host, we have those applications running in the native container, and they can only access the resources that the user has allowed. So for example, we see the application on the left has access to the network and location, and the application on the right has access to the photos library because of the requests the application has made and the consent the user has given. Over in the Win32 container, where compatibility is more important, these applications behave just like they would on a Windows desktop machine. So the applications can communicate freely with each other, they can send messages, they can use RPC or COM to talk to each other, and they can read and write the file system and the registry much as they would on a normal desktop machine. Now, the MSIX application has a little bit of lightweight virtualization to help with that clean install, uninstall we mentioned, but generally it behaves just like any other Win32 app would. And so the final piece of the puzzle is how these applications in the Win32 container can talk to those host resources, so the network, the location, and the libraries. And so there is a channel for the guest to talk to the host resources that kind of completes the picture of the high-level architecture for containers in Windows 10X. So to look at this a little bit in practice, let's go ahead and switch to a demo of looking at running processes with Windows Device Portal. Now, if you're not familiar with Windows Device Portal or you don't have the emulator yet, my colleague Claire has a video on how you can download these things and use these things. So I highly recommend you watch her video if you have not done so yet. So I'm going to switch over to our emulator here. And you can see here, this is the dual screen emulator running on my PC, and I have calculator here on the left, and we can see I can use this, and math works on the calculator. And over here on the right, I have Notepad running, and I can type into Notepad, so we have input, etc. working on Notepad. But Calc is a UWP app running in one of those native containers, and Hello World is a Win32 app running inside the Win32 container. So let's have a look at what that looks like in terms of running processes. So here is the Windows Devices Portal. Again, Claire's video will tell you more about it. And we can go and look at running processes on the emulator. I'm just going to pause these so they don't rearrange. Here in the drop-down, you'll see we have the host, and we have here Centennial Container. That's an internal name that will be rebranded Win32 Container, but that's what that means. If we look at the host, and we sort these by name, we will see the applications, the processes running on the Windows 10X host. So we see right here, calculator.exe, we see a bunch of other things, but what you don't see is Notepad. We go from M, Modern UX Shell Apps, to P, Printer Discovery. So there's no Notepad running in here. But you will see a bunch of other things like runtime brokers, service hosts, etc., things that are familiar to someone who's used a Windows operating system before. So they're the processes running on the host. Now, if I switch here to look at the container and refresh my list, Now we'll see that there's no calc because calc was running in the host operating system. And if we scroll down here, we will see here is our Notepad process running here. And so Notepad, along with all these other processes, more service hosts, etc., are running in the Win32 container. Calc is running in the host, and they're separate environments. Again, they have separate kernels. They're quite separate for most intents and purposes. So that was just a quick demo of how the processes are separated between the host and the guest, and we'll return to these apps later. So now let's talk a little bit about accessing resources from the Win32 container. Now, if you have an application that's already running in a native container, a UWP app, nothing has changed for you. So the way that your apps access resources still stays the same in Windows 10X. So first, let's talk about files. So inside the Win32 container, remember, it's a highly compatible environment meant to look like a desktop operating system. So there's a familiar directory layout in the container. There's a Windows directory, there's a user directory, there's a program files directory, etc. So any application that expects to see those directories will see them just fine in the Win32 container. Similarly, if you have application code that tries to evaluate environment variables like window or user profile, or it uses shell functions like should-get-known-folder-path, they all work correctly, they all give you the right answers to maintain compatibility with existing application code. And finally, as we saw in that high-level architecture slide, the user's content, their documents, their photos, etc., are shared between the Win32 container and the host. And so if an application writes a document to the documents library in the Win32 container, it's available to applications running in the host, for example, maybe their email client or their web browser. Now, private app data, so your own configuration files, your caches, your databases, etc., those are not made available to the host environment, and that's basically to give a simplified experience to the user, and so they don't get to see a bunch of files that they shouldn't be messing with. But all the user's content that's put into inside the user's libraries will be available across the host and the Win32 container. Now let's talk about accessing hardware from the Win32 container. So most of the hardware you would see in a traditional PC is just going to work on Windows 10X. So all the input you want, mouse, keyboard, touch, pen, that all works, low latency. DirectX graphics, media, video, audio, that all works. And things like networking and printing just work from the Win32 container on Windows 10X. So all those things are hooked up for you. Again, they have fast paths to the host OS, so it's a better experience than if you were doing a normal remote desktop to a VM. Access to some of those privacy-sensitive resources, like the camera, microphone, and location, are still under the user's control. But unlike native containers, where the user can pick per application if they want to allow access, these privacy-sensitive resources are essentially turned on or off at the entire container level. So if the user doesn't want any Win32 apps using their camera, they can turn off camera. And then finally, in this first release of Windows 10X, there is no support for non-standard hardware or software installed drivers. So, but all the typical hardware you would find on a PC will just work in Windows 10X. And let's do a quick demo of Notepad just to look at those files and printing. So if we switch back to our emulator, here we have Notepad, and I can just go ahead and hit Save As. You'll see a very familiar looking File Save As dialog, and you can see here are my libraries for my documents, etc. If I scroll down to the hard drive, I can see there are a bunch of directories here. There's the Windows directory, there's the users directory, there's program files, etc. And so all the directories that an application expects to exist on Windows will exist inside the Win32 container. And of course, if I wanted to print this, I can go File, Print. I get a print dialog, and you see here that the Save as PDF printer is available. I'm not going to print today, but that would work from Notepad as well. Now, if we go over here on the left, where I have the modern File Explorer in the host operating system, you'll see here that I only really have access to my content. I have my documents, my favorites, pictures, music, etc. But there's no way to really navigate the entire disk. And that's, again, to give a simplified user experience to the user. So any content that an app in the Win32 container saves into these libraries is visible to the host, but content saved in some of those other directories is not. Now let's talk about shell experiences in the Win32 container. As you've seen, Windows 10 X has a new, simplified shell, but a lot of things that users expect just work the same way as they do on Windows 10 desktop. For example, there's a start menu, there's a taskbar, you can alt-tab between windows, you can copy and paste, drag and drop, etc. So all the things users are used to on Windows 10 desktop continue to work in Windows 10 X and the Win32 container. But there are some desktop shell features that are not present in Windows 10 X though. For example, there's no system tray in the bottom right-hand corner, there are no File Explorer plugins or namespace extensions, and things like global mouse hooks, keyboard hooks, and window hooks are not supported on the Windows 10 X shell. That doesn't mean that your applications will crash though if you're trying to run them in the Win32 container. The APIs still exist, for example, to put your application in the system tray, but there's simply no place in the Windows 10 shell where that system tray icon will appear. So the app does not crash, but also the user does not see the system tray icon. So there might be an impact to some apps who have a primary surface, that is the system tray icon. They will have to move to a different mode of interaction with the user on Windows 10 X. Now let's talk a little bit about app lifecycle on Windows 10 X. Now, as you've been hearing about Windows 10 X, we're doing a lot in the operating system to try and balance the battery life of the device with the performance of applications. Because when users buy new, modern, portable devices, they expect both very long battery life and great performance of the applications they're using. And so Windows 10 X does some things in order to balance these two to give the best possible user experience. So for the Win32 container, again, this is where all the Win32 apps run, including MSX packaged apps. For the Win32 container, when no windows are visible, Windows 10 X will reduce the resources available to those Win32 applications. This is in order to give more resources to the foreground app the user is currently interacting with. Furthermore, if all windows are closed from the Win32 container, so there are no more top-level windows, the entire container can be suspended, giving back more life to the battery and more performance to other applications. Now, we're investigating a user preference to disable these features if a user decides that they'd rather have the Win32 container running all the time, because that works better for their workflow. But by default, the container will be managed to improve battery life and improve performance of foreground applications. And again, for the native container, just like with resource access, nothing has changed. Just like on desktop or Xbox or HoloLens, UWP apps already know how to respond to suspend and resume events. They're already power managed and they already give you the best possible performance and battery life on the device. And so nothing has changed for native containers. So with the suspension and so on, how is application execution going to work in Windows 10 X? Well, again, it's focused on both battery life and security, but we believe users will see performance improvements versus desktop in many cases, and a couple of reasons for that. The first one is that although the resources available to non-visible windows will be reduced, that means there are more resources available to the window the user is actually interacting with. So the foreground window that the user is actively using will have more resources available to it than if it was running on a desktop machine where there might be more background processes running. Furthermore, some of the security defaults in Windows 10 X reduce the overhead needed for anti-malware software. And so again, those resources are now available to applications to use on Windows 10 X. And there will be another video about security on Windows 10 X, so you can learn more about that too. Now, this does mean that some things either don't work or work a little bit differently on the Win32 container on Windows 10 X. First, there are no startup tasks in the Win32 container that would launch at logon. Typically, a startup task will do something like put itself into the system tray and then wait for user input. But since there's no system tray visible in Windows 10 X, it doesn't really make sense to launch those apps at startup. So those apps will not launch on Windows 10 X. Windows 10 X does support background tasks, including Windows NT services, but they might be suspended if there are no visible windows. And so a service can run while windows are available, but when no windows are open, those services might be suspended. And finally, system tools that rely on seeing all the processes in the system or all the top-level windows in the system will work a bit differently on Windows 10 X because they will only see the processes or windows that are inside the Win32 container. Just as we saw with the Windows Devices portal, the process list inside the container is different than the process list inside the host, and so those applications that expect to see all processes will work a little bit differently on Windows 10X. And then finally, in the first release of Windows 10X, there is no support for applications that contain both a UWP portion and a Win32 portion. Those applications will not run on Windows 10X version 1. So, quick wrap up about what we talked about today, starting with a call to action. So first, please install the Windows 10X emulator. Again, Claire has a talk on this. She'll tell you how to get it from the Microsoft Store. Remember, this is an early access build you'll have access to, and so there will be bugs. And please send file feedback on those bugs. Secondly, once you have the emulator, try installing your apps just as a consumer would. So download from your website, or if it's in the Microsoft Store, download it from the store and see what happens. Use the feedback hub to let us know if things aren't working as you expect. If you do see issues with your app, or you want to start improving your app on Windows 10X, use Visual Studio and the remote tools to debug your applications. Again, Claire will talk about that. And finally, keep your emulator up to date, as we'll be constantly fixing bugs, improving compatibility in the Windows 10X operating system, so that more and more applications will run. So in conclusion, what we've talked about today in this video. First, Windows 10X will run most existing applications at launch. It will do that by running them inside containers, either the Win32 container, an MSX container, or a native container. The reason Win 10X uses containers is to balance application compatibility with the security and battery life goals of a modern device. Although most apps will run, some apps or features of apps won't work due to missing dependencies, but compatibility will improve over time with regular updates. And please, if you're a developer, try your app on Windows 10X emulator, give us feedback, and let us know what's working and what's not working. Thanks for watching today.